Recording in progress.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here for our third virtual session this morning. We're excited to go through some more of the details here. Are you all seeing a blue line on the screen, or is this only me?
Yes, we can.
You can. Well, that's fine.
Và y chang hồi tưởng đầu Tam Quốc diễn
Okay.
nghĩa.
Apparently I did that. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Let's see. Before we get started diving in, here's the course website again, as Sarah just put in the chat. The website includes not only the slides for today, which are now up, but also the recordings from the prior two sessions. So if there's something you missed, or there was conversation we had that you don't think is clear in the slides and you want to go back and look, those are all there. So you can go ahead and see those recordings. Okay. Today, I'll say one more thing in a minute. Today we are going to focus on extracting and organizing the data. So once you've searched for all of your records, that you've then gone through all of the work of screening the records, you've decided this is what's in our study, then what? Then what do you do? Your next step is to pull all of the data out in some systematic and easy to understand way so that you can then quickly, or maybe not quickly, but more easily look at what did you find across all of the studies so that you can make comparisons. So we'll talk about some ways to do that today. Then we'll talk some about how you actually summarize the data and what meta-analysis is, and then we'll talk about evaluating bias. How do you evaluate the quality of the studies you're including? So those are our three topics today, and then all the other pieces here that are going a little bit deeper, putting some finishing touches, we will do when we're in person in December. But before we dive in, I'll also just say, I know that the groups turned in your PICOS, you turned in homework with your PICOS categories, definitions, and your research questions, and they're really quite good. Sada and I were talking earlier about feeling very impressed by what we were seeing. We are going through and making detailed comments, and I was hoping to have them to send back to you all before this class, but very close. We'll be ready to send them to you right after this class, so you'll have them by this afternoon. I'll be sending them back. So they're coming with feedback. All right. Let's move ahead then. We're going to talk about data extraction, coding, and critical appraisal. We're here on number 4 of these 7 steps. And I have a note for myself to remember to tell you all. Yesterday I wasn't able to show you the bulk duplicate. There was something wrong with my plugin for removing duplicates all in bulk from Zotero. So let me just very quickly show you on the, and then I'll come back to this data extraction. On the course website, the link has been updated now. Here, I can bring it up, and I'll show you first on the website. It says Zotero plugin to bulk remove duplicates. That's from yesterday, day 9. But what was at that link yesterday has been updated. So now it's a more direct, instead of going to a GitHub site, it brings you right to the instruction page for how to get this plugin. So if you click on that link, it brings you to this website, and the plugin is called Zoplicate, I guess is how you would say that. And the whole purpose of this plugin is to detect and manage duplicates in Zotero, because Zotero itself, as you saw yesterday, it's built for you to use your human brain to go and manually compare, is this study the same as that study? Yes, I'm convinced it is. Remove the duplicate. Okay, how about this one? Remove the duplicate. It's best to do that manually if you have a reasonable number of duplicates. You know, in our practice example that I was demonstrating yesterday, we had, I think, 80 duplicates. You could do that manually. It won't take you 1 minute, but it's doable to compare and make sure that it's working properly. But if you're starting with 10,000 records to screen, you may decide we're just going to use a tool to bulk remove duplicates. And you would report as part of your report when you write up your article that that's what you did. You brought you used Zotero, you brought in all of the articles that had been screened from the various databases, and then you used the Zoplicate plugin to bulk remove duplicates. You would actually say that. So if you choose to do that, if what you're doing is kind of big enough or you want to have that option, you can click on that link from the course website, and then it tells you all sorts of things. But as you scroll down, it shows how to install it. You click here, you do that. I did it today. It definitely works. It gives you examples of how to set your settings, and then as you keep scrolling down, it tells you what to do, how to do it, all the steps to take. So everything you need is on this website. When you install your plugin and you're using it, this is what we were using yesterday in Zotero. Now when I go to duplicate items, you see this button here that didn't exist before. That's what was broken. And if you can see that there's, sorry, your faces are in the way. Okay, so you can see there's 46 is the number here. And let's actually check. If you go to the main page, there are 82 items left in the view. So if we go to duplicate items and do bulk merge, and it says, this will merge all the duplicate items. Are you sure you want to do this? And it lets you pick the settings. So you can say, I want you to always merge the newer item into the older item, or vice versa. I want you to merge the older item into the newer item that's the same. Or in this case, it's whichever one has the most detail. Use that as the master item and merge the other one that has less detail into it. So it doesn't delete one. It merges the information together from the two pieces. So I'll say, yes, I want to continue. It takes a moment. You can see it's getting rid of all the duplicates. It's making decisions. Interesting. I'm not sure. Oh, if it's not sure, then you can say, yes, I want to, or no, they are not duplicates, right? I could make the decision, but let's try this again. Maybe not. Okay. Well, anyway, you can go back to that instruction screen and see what to do. But the point is now, if you go here, there's only 59 items in the view, right? It merged so that you got rid of those duplicates. So now, except for the fact that I'm not going to take time now, but I would have to figure out why this should only be 2 items. So there should ultimately, that should be fixed. And then there will be 57 items in the view, right? So then I would say, we went to Embase, we found 62 records. We went to PubMed, we found 24 records. We used the Zoplicate bulk removal plugin from Zotero to remove duplicates. And after we removed duplicates, there were 57 items left that were unique items. And then those 57 items are what you would put in this screening folder, which you could then divvy up in the subfolders. And then once those had been screened, you would have some subset of the 57 items that you would put in a new folder called full text. You would add the full text, and then you would break it up and screen those again. And then you would end up with some subset of those that are the final ones screened in that are being included in your review. And those are the articles you would then proceed to this next step around data extraction, coding, and critical appraisal. Oops, not that. That. So hopefully that was more clear. And again, the formatting of that web page for the Zoplicate plugin is not beautiful, but all of the content is there. So as you search through, you'll be able to find whatever you need to make it work, or you should be able to. So definitely not required to do that, especially if your review is a manageable number of studies, to do a manual comparison, but it's important to know if it's something where you just think, this is going to take us weeks just to remove the duplicates. You should be using technology to help you out. All right. Let's see. I see there's a question there. Okay, so the question in the chat is around what's a good range of the number of databases to include, and what are the best and most comprehensive ones? I would always include PubMed, but sometimes it's hard to choose the rest. So I often, and I see the ones you have listed here, so often people will look in PubMed, Embase, and Scopus. Or maybe just two of those. I think it's always good to use more than one, just to make sure you're not missing more. If you use something like the Polyglot tool or Embase, as we saw yesterday, Embase will let you use the query translator to get your syntax from PubMed. Once you've developed your syntax once, it doesn't take very long to translate that syntax and try it in a new database and export those. If you then import that into something like Zotero and you're using the technology to remove duplicates, it doesn't add a whole lot of work to add extra databases. So you don't need to do 7. But 2 or 3, I think, is a very good number, and it's very commonly what you will see. I would say 2 is sort of the best practice at the minimum. Embase and Scopus are really common ones, but it may also depend on your topic. So maybe you would use PsycInfo, or if you're focused specifically on Vietnam, there may be some local database you would also want to use, even though it has a much smaller set of articles. It might add 1 or 2 or 3 that are not indexed in PubMed. In Medline, maybe that's worthwhile. So I think the simple answer is good to always include PubMed. If you have access to Embase and Scopus, those are also good to include. If you're focused on RCTs, then very often people will want to use the Cochrane library and also search in the Cochrane database for for clinical trials. But there's really no right answer. You should think through, what's my topic and where are most of the articles found that I think are written about this topic. And you may have to do a little bit of scoping search to try to find that answer. Hopefully that helps answer your question. Okay. So I have promised you for 2 days that we would talk, before we talk about extracting the data, we also need to talk about, you can only extract the data if you have full text, right? If you can't access the full text with the article, you really can't realistically include it in a systematic review in almost all cases, because you can't access the full text. I mean, because you can't find all of the details, so you need to have the full text. So what do you do if it's very difficult for you to access the full text? Hopefully, through HMU or other institutions, you're actually able to access a lot of that. We heard, I think it was Wednesday, we heard that there's librarians at your library here who might be able to help you with some of these things, or request articles that you otherwise might not be able to get yourself online. But sometimes, depending on where you live and what your affiliation is with different institutions, it can be very difficult. And so it seems important to talk about what are some strategies. So here are 6 common strategies for what you might do besides just using a VPN through your institution, or asking your librarian to get you a copy. What else can you do? So one option is to look on one of these websites. You could look on Google Scholar. Sometimes you can find a PDF that is actually behind a paywall on the publisher's website, but someone has posted it somewhere and it's there. And you can find it when you go to Google Scholar and you put the title in, you suddenly see, oh, there's a PDF. Same with ResearchGate or academia.edu. Sometimes researchers have uploaded their full text, whether or not they were technically supposed to because of the paywall. Sometimes they have. And if they're there, then great, you can grab them. So those are good places to check first and just see if you can find one there. Another place is to look at OSF. They have a lot of articles that have been archived there. And in your slides, you should be able to actually click on these hyperlinks to get there. Another tool is, this is through the University of Michigan at Flint. They have, it says open access, but it actually, the tool returns a lot, it's a search that returns a lot of articles that through the University of Michigan, I think they have access to it, but you don't have to have a login for the University of Michigan to access those articles. I have had success finding articles there that I couldn't access otherwise, so that's worth giving it a try. There are also request sites, and on the next screen I'll show you a few. There are request sites like there's a subreddit. If you're a Reddit user, there's a subreddit, r/scholar, where people will post and say, I'm looking for this article. Does anyone know where it is? And then someone will sometimes post it. And those things are searchable, so you can see if anybody has requested that article before. You can also contact the authors and ask for a copy. Almost every article has a corresponding author with an email, which may or may not be updated, but you can certainly give it a try and try contacting the author and saying, I'm doing a review. I would really like to include your article, but I can't seem to access the full text. Could you send it to me? You may not get a response, but you might. It might surprise you, and so it's worth taking that step. And then the sixth option is just to see, sometimes there's a preprint of the article, and it may be slightly older, slightly outdated, framed slightly differently, and it's not peer-reviewed, but maybe you can tell from the abstract, from the title, from the authors, that it's basically the same article. And you could include the preprint instead of the full text of the peer-reviewed version that's behind the paywall. But if you do that, you should just note that. You should say, there are, these 16 articles that we included, but we were only able to access the preprint version, and that's what was included, and those are what's cited in the references page. Don't use it as a substitute and pretend like you were using the real full text from the peer-reviewed journal, but just substitute the preprint. Be clear that you were using the preprint version. So hopefully those suggestions, it will not solve all of your problems, but hopefully they'll at least get a few of them, especially if there's one or two that you think are very important to your review, they're very critical, and you can't seem to access them. These are some options. And again, talk to your librarian, who's probably very savvy about how to do this and may be able to ask for getting others to send it so that they can share it with you. The other thing that I will say, and this is not a recommendation or an endorsement to use any of these sites, but this is a thread from someone on Twitter, now X, I guess, who was talking about how difficult it can be to access full text and providing other kinds of options. Some of these are blocked in different countries, or they're outdated, or they are violating copyright. So, you can see here, like this one has questionable legality. This one is legal. You can sort of see some options, but I'm not recommending you use these, but I think if you were searching on Twitter yourself, you might come across this thread, and these are some suggestions from this doctor of things that might be useful if you're really stuck and you can't access the information. It sounds like you might not need these things because of your affiliation with HMU, and so maybe it's not an issue, but we have definitely talked with people trying to do systematic reviews in countries and institutions where they just do not have access. They can't afford the subscriptions, they don't have access. And so sometimes if you want to do a good systematic review, you need to be a little creative, which is why we wanted you to just see that this was an option someone had put out there. I have not vetted or validated any of these, and again, it's not a specific recommendation, but something you could look at. Okay, so now you have all of your full text. Now it's time to extract the data. So I'm going to pass it over to Sara and let her talk you through that.
Yeah, thank you. So you've identified the studies you want to include, and now it's going to be about extracting the data. So data extraction is a structured and systematic process. The goal really is to collect all the information you need from each study in a consistent and transparent way. The first step is to develop a structured data extraction format. This can be a spreadsheet, a form, a database, whatever works best for you and your team. But really the key is consistency and having this structured format. You'll want to list exactly what information you plan to collect for your review. And this list should really align with your plans, meaning it should reflect what you described in your protocol, and for example, your PICOS framework, your outcomes of interest, and any subgroup variables. You'll need to decide how to handle the data extraction process itself. So how will you organize and store the extracted data? Who will have access to it? Will you extract data into Excel, Covidence, REDCap, something else? It's also a really good idea to assign unique identifiers to each study. So every included study might get a number or a label, like you might have study 1, study 2, and so on. Then for each report or publication that's linked to that same study, you would assign a report identifier that ties it back to the main study ID. So for example, if you have a study that has multiple reports, you might label that first study, study 01, and then each report that is associated with that study, you would label 01.01, 01.02, 01.03, and so on and so forth, where the 01 is referring to that first study, and then the number after the decimal refers to each specific report. This helps to really keep your records clean, especially if there are multiple papers that come from the same underlying trial or study. Finally, before you start your full-scale extraction, it's really important to pilot test your data extraction form. So in this case, you might have 2 independent coders extract data from the same study using your form and then compare those results. If there are discrepancies, you would talk those through as a team. You would refine your form or the instructions, maybe if the instructions were not really clear, until both of the coders are really consistently extracting the same information from each study. And the pilot step really helps to ensure that your process is reliable, replicable, and transparent, which obviously we've said those things quite often now. These are key hallmarks to a high quality systematic review, that it's replicable, transparent, reliable, and systematic in this way. Okay, so we then need to kind of think through, what do we actually extract from the studies? So obviously, you'll want to extract the full citation. This includes the authors in order of appearance, the title, the source, the year of publication, DOI, the type of publication, and a registry identifier if that's applicable. But there are a whole host of other things that are included in every article, every report on a study. And so we're going to go through the different kind of headers and write your ideas in the chat. What would you want to bring out in terms of study design? What kind of data would you want to extract? And you can put it in the chat for everyone. Yeah, type of study, sure. Anything else on study design? Sample size, search design, location, recruitment method. Yeah, we came up with a list as well. Could be the number of sites involved, the type of sites, locations, as was mentioned, the type of locations, whether it's rural or urban or something else, the number of groups or cohorts, whether it's a comparison involved or a control, how the groups were formed, and then the number and timing of any waves. You see a couple of other recruitment criteria and study population. Yeah. Speaking of study population.
Sara, can I just quickly add one thing?
Yeah.
I think I just want to make sure it's clear that all of these things that you see here, you don't need to always extract all of these things. These are just examples or ideas. Your team needs to decide what are the things that are actually useful for you. What will you be looking at? What will you want to use to describe the studies or compare the studies in your specific systematic review? So like what is relevant to you about the study design? These are just some examples. And then whichever things you think are relevant and important to include, those would be, for example, columns in your Excel sheet. So you would have one for number of sites involved, and then every single record, whoever's doing the extraction for that record would write the number in that column. And then you'd have a separate column for the locations, the countries, and then people who are extracting in every row, they would write what the countries are. I just want to make sure it's clear you're sort of understanding the concept of how you would use what this list is. Okay, go ahead, Seth.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I'll also say on the course website, there is a resource under day 3 called Extracting Data Quick Sheet, and it includes all of these pieces as well. So you can also use that to help spark some of the ideas around it. And yeah, thank you. Yes. So we'll go through a couple of more of these kind of like big headers and think through a little bit of your ideas around what you might want to extract in terms of, in this case, data collection, and we'll do data collection and methods of data collection at the same time. What are some of the things that you would be interested in extracting?
Now everyone's going to download that quick sheet so that they can see what we came up with.
No pressure whatsoever here.
Should I reveal some so that people can start getting the hang of it by seeing our examples?
Yeah.
Or wait.
Sure.
There we go, we're starting to see some.
Yeah, and for method of collection, there are a variety of different things that would also be included under how the data was collected as well. So you'll want to also kind of break down not just the method of collection, but what does that mean? Who collected the data? Was it researchers? Was it self-reported? Is it a survey, for example? Was it double-blinded? Were the researchers blinded to the group status? Or how were the data collected, whether it was a phone call or survey or in-person meeting. And then in terms of the actual data collection, you might extract the name and the source of the measure, the results of reliability and validity testing. Are the measures continuous or dichotomous? Are high scores negative or positive events? Someone also mentioned already the timing. And then, yes, data sources. So again, who was collecting that data? Okay, we're going to try another one. And here, what would you want to know about participants and sample size or composition of the participants? What kinds of things could you think of to extract from the studies?
Remember again, the idea of extracting the data is so that you don't have to go back. Yes, exactly, these types of things. You don't have to go back to the full text. Once you have finished extracting all the data, then that spreadsheet becomes the thing you write your systematic review from. So what types of things would you need to know about participants so that you could summarize anything? Like I was looking at your different PICOS definitions, and sometimes people would say, we're looking at patients and comparing whether they're in the ICU in the hospital or inpatient or in surgical. You would need to know, like, what's the setting where the participants are, for example. Anything like that that you think you'd want to know for your review, you need to be systematically collecting here. Yeah, there we go. There's some things coming in.
Yeah. These are all great examples. So demographic information, that could be age. So it doesn't mean that you're collecting the information on every individual participant. You probably won't receive that from the report, but maybe the range or the mean or the standard deviation, gender, region or country, socioeconomic status, health status, mental health status. Very good. How about with sample size or composition? Any thoughts around what might be in a study that you would extract? Yeah. So how many, your attrition rate, right? Like how many people dropped out, how many were eligible. Very good. Do you want to pop those up? Yeah. So the number of potentially eligible, those that were confirmed, those that were included, those that actually completed the study, those that were included in all of the reporting. Very good. And the last couple here, intervention information and study results. Any thoughts around what types of data would you want to extract in terms of the intervention itself? Mhm. What kind of intervention?
Especially if your review is looking at multiple intervention types, there are multiple options. Like some of you are thinking about a whole category of, for example, dietary interventions. You might ask, which of the types of dietary interventions did this particular study look at? And that's what you would include. That may not apply to whatever you're doing, but it might be a great example of something that makes sense for your review.
Yeah. I see a lot of duration, the protocol for the intervention, the indicators of effectiveness is likely to be under study results, very, very likely. But so duration, as mentioned multiple times here, the hours of direct contact, the frequency of that contact, are people meeting once a week or once a month? Collateral contact, so that's not just like direct face-to-face, but how many text messages, for example, were sent out as reminders? The types of services, as kind of mentioned, around what kind of intervention, and then service provider characteristics, whether this is happening at a hospital or a community-based organization, for example. And then, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, or some of you talked about comparing like peer interventions to other, maybe it's by a nurse or by a doctor or by a peer or by someone else. So those might be other things that you want to kind of keep track of which types of service providers delivered the intervention in a particular study in your review. Go ahead, Seth. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's great. Okay, and then for study results, these are going to be the actual outcomes, right? So for this, we might see, for example, effect size, or the association or difference in proportions or means, variance, or a number for each group, for each measure, for each data point. So this is where you'll really want to have this information, especially if you're doing a meta-analysis. Again, you don't want to have to go back to each individual study to try and pull more information. So again, thinking up front around what kind of information you actually need to extract while you're making your plan can be extremely helpful to ensure that you don't have to do extra work or go back and do work again.
Great. One more thing before we move on to the next topic, I just wanted to quickly show you also on the course website. This is actually in the section from yesterday, from day 2, but I told you yesterday that there were these tools that my team used when we did that systematic review on smoking cessation in Appalachia in the United States. And so yesterday I showed you that the screening tool we used was there for your use, but there's also a data extraction tool. And so if you go to that, I'll just show you very quickly so that you can see what it looks like. Well, pretty quickly. Taking a long time. Okay. Oh. Go. Okay. So this is the actual spreadsheet that we used, and hopefully you're all seeing it. Yeah, I think you are. And so it's in here. I mean, you can see how many we ended up including in the end in this review, which was published. The publication is also linked on the page if you want to see how we ended up reporting it. But this is what we used when the team extracted the data, and these are the ones that we actually used in the meta-analysis. So there were more studies in the entire review, but then only a few had the specific interventions we were interested in for the meta-analysis. So that's what happens to be here. But you can see we just did it in Excel. It didn't have to be very fancy. And the first row here are all of the categories that we wanted to extract. And then you can see in the red is kind of our little definition of to help the people who are doing the extraction to know, what am I supposed to be writing? What are my choices? What am I supposed to be extracting? And then the people doing the extraction, there's the study ID, which is the same study number we used on the screening tool, for example. And then which outcome are they looking at? And then a reminder of the study. And then everything else here is just being extracted right from the paper. And that way you can go back later and just look at this to do your meta-analysis. So anyway, the details of this are not very important. The point is that this is how you might set something up. You certainly don't have to do it this way, but this is an example of how you might set something up where you're then giving everybody their assignment. So this was just my assignment, by the way. I'm SF, so this wasn't even the complete amount for everybody. These are the ones that were assigned to me. I went through, and you can see these are repeated on here because they're different outcomes. So this was the study looking at the first outcome we were interested in, and then this is the study looking at the second outcome. So a lot of this is exactly the same, right? The total number of patients, everything didn't change, but then when you get over here to what was the type of measure reported and all of these details, it changed, which is why you see duplicates. So you can, similar to how we talked about the screening, you could have someone who's organizing and they're setting this up. Everybody's getting the same structure, but then each person who's doing data extraction gets a certain number of rows with the studies that they're assigned, and then they're filling out all of this by reviewing the full text. So that's basically the process for going through data extraction. Before we move on to the next piece, are there any other questions you all have about what you would do to extract the data here? This is like with the screening, this is not very quick, right? Depending on how many studies you're including in your review, which is often, you know, even if it's 10 or 15, and sometimes it's many more, sometimes it's 50 or 60 that you end up including. Having people go through, especially if you're having two people, as Sada said, best practice is have two people extract from every study so that you make sure that you're getting the accurate information, you're able to compare. Going through each study, reading the full text, figuring out all these details, filling out the spreadsheet, it takes a while. So you need to just build the time in. Don't think this is something you'll just do on a Monday night and you'll be done with your extraction. It is not that fast, I promise. Okay. Seeing no questions for now, we're going to move ahead and talk a bit more about what I referred to before as what everyone calls figure one, right? It's just called figure one. It's always the figure one in a systematic review according to the PRISMA guidelines. And so in the PRISMA statement, you can actually click on this link and they talk about what's supposed to be included in the flow diagram. There are many different tools available to help you do this, but and they're all slightly different. They're all slightly different versions, but more or less, every report that you write of a systematic review should have a figure one that looks kind of like this, your PRISMA flow diagram. And so we'll go through each section and discuss. This picture you're seeing here, this screenshot, is on day 3 of the course website. It's a PowerPoint file that looks exactly like this, and it's meant so that it's a template for you. You can go in and change the title how you want. You can remove the icon if you want, that's fine. And then you go in and you say, PubMed, from this time to this time, we returned, what was it on our Zotero example, 24 articles. And then you would say, Embase, 62 articles. And then sources remaining after removing duplicates. You're just filling in the numbers, right? So we'll go through this a little bit now. Here's an example. It's a little less pretty, but here's an example of a real systematic review that was published. And just to explain how you read it, you can see that there were a total of 1,886 records between these two, right? They're not doing the math for you, but I just did. You add those together. They excluded 134 duplicates, and then they did all of their screening, and in the end, they only included 11 articles in the review. So this is the purpose of something like this being your figure 1, is everybody is able to see how many did you start with, why are the reasons things were excluded, and how many did you end up with, how many are included in the review. Here's another example. In this case, this one I think I showed yesterday. This started with 1,995 articles. They didn't say where they got it from in this picture. They didn't say whether it was Embase or PubMed or somewhere else, but hopefully it says that in the text of the article when you look. They excluded duplicates here, and then they were left with this many unique titles. They then just, in this case, they just screened the titles. That's pretty rare, but in this case they did. They excluded a little less than half for these reasons. They were left with 680 abstracts. They did another round and excluded all but 168 from the abstracts. These are the ones they looked at the full text. Then when they screened the full text, they excluded another 144, and they were left with 24 full texts that they included in the review, and these were the 24 articles they used for data extraction. So you can see they started with almost 2,000, and they ended up with only 24 they need to do data extraction. That's actually good. That's reasonable. That's not failure. That's a much more manageable number that you can actually write something useful about. So that's good. Sometimes people worry that their number ends up too small at the end, but this is a perfectly reasonable number. Okay, so the first thing is to the best practice is to record the number of results from each place that you searched. So we already talked about databases. If you're also searching gray literature, you're searching websites, you're looking for reports, you would say how many you found from doing that. And this hand searching, this essentially is a technique where you look in the reference list of the articles that you already included from your database search, and you see, is there anything in these articles that they cited that seems relevant that for some reason didn't come up in my search? So it gives you a chance to do a hand search and just pull extras in, usually very specifically from the references, the ones turned up in your search. And so you would say, when we did a hand search of all of the references, we came up with another 4 that had been missed, for example. And then you fill in how many are after removing duplicates from something like Zotero or Rayon or Covenants, whatever it is. Okay, then you get to the place where you're talking about screening the title and abstract, right? And we've talked about this already, so I'll go through it pretty quickly. But basically, you say at the top how many total were excluded at this step, and then specify what were the reasons that they were excluded. And you can actually give the specific number for those. And then how many are left that you did with a full text screen, that you looked for full text to screen. So the number up above, this number, the sources remaining after removing duplicates, minus this number, the number you excluded, should equal this number, right? It should be very simple math. And all of these numbers, the reasons, should add up to this number. So hopefully that makes sense. Yes, I'm going to keep going through this figure 1, but I see the question about gray literature, and I will go back to that. So hold on one moment, but then I will. Then you've got, let me go back here. You've got this number that you're screening with full text, and you're repeating the same thing, right? That number on the prior screen minus this number should equal this number. After you have finalized your eligible sources by looking at full text, how many did you end up including in your review? And again, all of these numbers here should add up to this number right here. This bottom box is your N for your systematic review. This is actually what you're including. And then the bottom of this figure is if you're doing meta-analysis, which you may or may not, then another step that looks basically the same, but sometimes you include more articles in the full review than you're including in the meta-analysis. Like everything in the meta-analysis maybe needs to have the quantitative outcome you're interested in. Maybe your systematic review overall includes other things, but the only ones included in the meta-analysis have a certain quantitative outcome. So a reason for excluding might be only qualitative data. How many were excluded for that reason? Or the relevant data was not available to be extracted. You just couldn't extract what you needed to include it in the meta-analysis, and you write that. So you do this step one more time if it applies. Otherwise, you don't have to worry about it. So this one's optional. This whole part is optional. Let me just show you a couple more quick examples, or actually, Sada's going to do that, and then I'll talk a little bit more about gray literature.
Yeah, so again, these are some examples of figure ones from a variety of different systematic reviews. In this one, you can see that they very similarly include identification here, and there were 2,959 records that were identified through database. And then they have this other box of 20 records that were identified through quote, other sources. There were a few records that were removed because they were duplicates, and that left 2,466 records that were screened. And then here they don't give a lot of they don't give any reasons why they excluded them, but they excluded 2,343 just from that initial screening, which left 123 articles that they assessed the full text of. And you can see here that they did give the reasons for excluding 111 of these articles, but they don't give the information around how many, which left them to have 12 studies that were included in their review, which was primarily a meta-analysis. So you see here that all 12 of these studies were included in that meta-analysis.
Sada, before we go to the next example, I just want to make sure that the earlier question in the chat around what do you do if you have a small number of appropriate studies, what to do then, I want to make sure that got answered, because I think this is a good illustration, right? This started with almost 3,000 records through database searching, but they ended up with only 12 that they included in the systematic review. And this was published in a health journal. You'll routinely see systematic reviews that only have 8 articles or 10 articles or 12 articles. It's less about the quantity and it's more about really the quality of the research question. Are you finding articles that are helping give more information to answer your research question? And is your research question important to the field? Is it filling some gap in knowledge? And if you end up doing that with only 6 or 8 studies, and you talk about the fact in your review that there were only 6 or 8 studies that actually looked at this question, we may need more studies to really have a conclusive answer. That's perfectly reasonable. So I would not get too hung up on the number. If you only end up with 1 study, okay, then you need to broaden your question. And so I would say if you're doing a systematic review, you shouldn't pivot to a scoping or a narrative review instead just because of the numbers. You should consider broadening your criteria so that what you're looking at in your research question of your review is actually broader so that you get more studies and are able to give more of a picture. You're just looking a little too narrowly. If you're only ending up with 1 or 2, that's not really worth doing. Hopefully that answers that question. Okay, thanks. Yeah, go ahead, Sada.
Yeah. This is another great example of what was just said, right? Like in this particular figure 1, we see that the end result here of the studies included were only 10. So here they start off with the records that were identified through databases, and here they do specify from PubMed, Embase, Web of Science, CINAHL, all of these different databases, and they had 1,319 from there. And then here they also do that there was a manual search of another 34 articles. Of those, 429 were excluded, and so you see that over 900 records were screened. Here again, they do give the reasons why records were excluded here with the numbers. So more specificity than what was provided in the last figure one that we saw. Of those, 67 were assessed the full text. And you can see here again that they do give the reasons why those full texts were excluded. There were 42 that were excluded here, which meant that 25 of those studies were eligible. And then these researchers did a quality assessment, and they then decided that 15 of these articles would be excluded because they were considered low quality, which left these 10 studies to be included. And then this last example is a little bit more complex. I'm going to explain exactly why that is in just a second. So this was a study on climate change and human health in Vietnam. And the researchers decided to not just look at articles that were in English, but also to identify those studies that were in Vietnamese. And so I know that there was a question either yesterday or the day before around language use. And you can see that not only did they look up in English and in Vietnamese, but they also partitioned their figure one to include the information about the studies in English, as well as the information about the studies in Vietnamese separately. So you see here that there was over 3,000 studies from these different databases, and 44 from these different databases within Vietnamese and then in English. You also can see here how many were removed at each step within this figure one. They have it side by side for each of the different steps. So in identification, you see that there were quite a few duplicates removed from the English side. And you can see that they specified that they used covenants to be able to identify duplicates, and they removed those using covenants. The 0 were removed manually, and then you can see kind of a little bit the opposite on the Vietnamese side, where 5 were removed manually and 0 were identified by covenants. Then you move into the screening, and you again can see that they don't provide a lot of detail on why things were excluded. They do have the number of studies excluded in both English and then in Vietnamese. And then you'll see here, we've talked a lot already about full text articles and what to do if something cannot be retrieved. So they have this very clearly here. Studies sought for retrieval was 158, but they could not retrieve 3 of these in English. And same on the Vietnamese side. They had 37 that they sought for retrieval, and then they could not retrieve 3 of those, so they excluded all of those studies. And then they assessed for eligibility and gave the reasons for exclusion in this particular box. And then the studies that were actually included in the review. And here they also included, instead of including them up top, that manual search, they included that manual search here at this point on the English side, and they included 2 additional articles. And this is where the total studies are combined together for 127 total studies that were included in the review. So these are just a couple of different examples of different ways that you can structure your figure one. Ultimately, they all have these same main categories and the same idea, and you as the reader can understand the flow of how they arrived at their total studies that were included from the initial identification of records. But each one is a little bit different in terms of how much detail they're providing, as well as some of the different steps that they're indicating within the figure 1.
Okay. Thank you. So I know there are, before we go on to the next section, which is to talk about meta-analysis, I see there are 2 questions in the chat to address. I'm going to do this last one first because it's easy. Yes, you can justify excluding a study if you cannot access the full text. If you've made reasonable efforts to obtain it, which frankly, I think many people who've done especially large systematic reviews, they're just searching whatever they can get through their institution, whatever free text is either open access or they have a subscription to through their university. And if they can't get it, they just exclude it. Ideally, you would take some extra steps in some of the creative ways that we talked about at the beginning of class today to try to access the full text. And then if you can't, you can't, right? Unfortunately, we live in a world where a lot of this information is restricted because people control it through copyright and wanting to make money through subscriptions. And so if you can't access the article, then you can't include it. And you just need to be clear about that. I think some of the, maybe not this one, but some of the examples we've shown before, I think. Let's see, your faces are in the way.
In that one.
So this one, they didn't break down the numbers of why, but here's one where some of these 111 were excluded because the full text articles were not found. Ideally, you would break that down and you'd say was this 4 or was this 110 of this number? It would be good to know. But yes, it's very common and it's very reasonable to do that. You can only do so much. So, good question. Okay, the question about gray literature. So gray literature will often not be a part of a systematic review. It depends on the question. Peer-reviewed journal article or a preprint maybe. It's not a typical academic journal article. It's something else. It's like a government report or some sort of summary. It's not usually just a web page. It's something typically more formal. If you remember from yesterday, I had a couple slides where I talked about like different sources that you consider, like what's the ending of the URL, you know, the suffix. Is this a reliable source? Can I feel confident that there's updated and accurate information about the source? Those are the types of websites beyond all of these different studies, databases that may be relevant to your question. So if you are doing a question where you're just looking at randomized control trials of a specific intervention to see if it impacted whether or not people had a successful surgical outcome, all of that is going to be in databases that you're looking for in peer-reviewed journals. That's all you need to do is search those databases. But I worked on a systematic review where we included a lot of gray literature. One of the research questions in the review was about how different countries or regions or studies were doing HIV surveillance using a certain type of HIV test that tested how recent the infection was, and whether they were using that, how they were using that, like the methods they were using to use those test results in a surveillance setting to calculate the kind of hotspots or where there was more recent spread of HIV in their community. And a lot of those things, those are like public health practice. Those are surveillance. Those are maybe a health department is using those tests. Everyone is getting this HIV test that gives whether the result is recent or not. It's being reported to the health department or the health ministry, and then someone's job is to calculate that information, and they release some sort of report. Well, that report won't necessarily be in, the British Medical Journal that then ends up in PubMed, but it might be on the website of the country. And so in that case, we actually did a survey. It was through the World Health Organization. And we did a survey. We sent out a survey through email to all of their country offices to say, do you use this testing technology? Have you written any reports about this testing technology and how you've used it for surveillance purposes? Please send them to us. And then a whole bunch of people emailed us these reports, but we knew they came from government sources, so they felt reliable. We explained all of that in our methods of the report, and then we used those reports to talk about what had happened, even though they weren't in databases, in these kinds of databases of peer-reviewed journals. They weren't in peer-reviewed articles. So that was where, we reported a lot of gray literature in the, sorry, I'm trying to go back here. Here, our gray literature number was actually quite large because it included every report that people had emailed us. So that's an example of gray literature. It may not apply in your situation, but if it makes sense for your research question to look for things that are not in peer-reviewed journals, then you describe how and why you did that, and you include that there. Okay, great. All right. Hopefully no more questions about figure 1. We went through a whole lot of examples, but if you do, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. But for now, we will go on and talk. Before we take a break, we'll talk fairly briefly about meta-analysis. So why I'm saying fairly briefly, I said this the first day when we started talking. You're not going to learn, if you are not a statistician who already does fairly sophisticated statistical analysis, you are not going to, at the end of this morning, be able to do meta-analysis. I'm not trying to teach you enough skills to do that. I'm trying to help you conceptually understand what a meta-analysis is, what you need to think about. And if you want to do a meta-analysis and you're not a statistician, you should be working with a statistician on your team who knows what they're doing and can do it. But I'll give you an overview before we take our break today. Okay, so meta-analysis is a two-step process. Basically, what you're doing in the first step, you're calculating a summary statistic for every study that's going to be included. So this means that you have to have an equivalent measure for whatever your outcome that you're interested in, the observed effect, in all of the studies that are being included in your meta-analysis. So again, you may have more studies. You may have 24 studies in your systematic review and only 8 or 10 that get included in your meta-analysis, because those are the only studies that all have an equivalent measure of the observed effect in the same way, so that you can pool them together. So the first thing is you have to figure out what that is and have extracted a statistic that's equivalent across all the studies to be included. And then in the second step, you're calculating a weighted average of those intervention effects in each of the individual studies so that you're arriving at a combined summary statistic. So you're getting a weighted average by assigning a weight to the different studies. And I'll give an example of how that's often done. It doesn't have to be, but how that's often done in a couple slides. And then you take the sum divided by the sum of the weights, and you come up with this weighted average, right? And the weighted average is then what you are typically sharing in your results. Meta-analyses are almost always illustrated through the use of what's called a forest plot. I'm guessing that this is familiar. It looks familiar enough to everybody on this call. We've all seen these types of things used if you've looked in any academic studies before. And so the point of a forest plot, and I'll show you some more examples that you can see more clearly too, is you're looking at each of these as an individual study, and you're seeing the estimate, which is the dot, and then the confidence interval for every study that's included, but you're also getting the pooled result from the meta-analysis, which is this dotted line. So you're seeing some studies are on the left side of the line, some studies are on the right side of the line, but here's the average across all of the studies. So a forest plot allows people who are reading your review to look at each of the individual inputs and then what did you learn when you combined them all statistically. That's the idea. This is a little blurry on the screen, but this is the part I wanted you to see. So this is a forest plot where they're getting even a little more fancy. They're showing the size of the square is related to the sample size of the group. So the bigger the N of the underlying study, the bigger the square, the smaller the study. And then the length of the confidence interval is related to the variance of the study, like the precision or how much variance there was in the study. And that's actually typically what's used to weight the study. So usually people are calculating an inverse variance weighted average is what it's called. So the more the variance in the study, the less weight it's given in the average. The more precision, sort of the shorter the confidence intervals, the more weight that study is given when it's pooled. And so you can again see the individual studies. They're showing how big the confidence interval is, how big the sample size is, where the odds ratio actually falls. And in this case, the dotted line, you see this two ways. Unlike what I showed you before, in this case, the dotted line is an odds ratio of 1. So this is the null. And anything where the box is on this side favors the intervention. Anything where the box is on this side of the line favors the control. And this little diamond here is showing you the pooled result. So the pooled average slightly favors the intervention. Looks like an odds ratio of 1.3 or 1.4. So that's how you read this. Now, oh, well, there you go. The odds ratio is 1.21. And then you can see the confidence interval, right? This is the pooled amount. So that's basically what you're doing in a meta-analysis. There are different variations, but this is the concept of what you do. And so again, you can only include the studies that are measuring the same thing so that you can pool it together. It's often even a smaller number than this, and there's nothing wrong with that. But this is what you're trying to do. What I will just say about, I won't go into detail tonight about creating a forest plot. You can do this in statistical software if you use R or Stata or any of those kinds of software. They all have the capacity to do a forest plot. It's a very common thing to do. But you don't have to have stat software. You can also do it without stat software. You can do it with Excel, for example. It's not just pushing a button in Excel, but it is doable. And so this link right here on the slides, and I think Sara can also drop that in the chat if it's easier for you. This will take you to a video that's a 9-minute step-by-step tutorial. The last time I taught this course, I actually played the 9-minute video, but I realized that it's very overwhelming for a lot of people, and it's better if you just are able to pause it. So you should watch it on your own. You listen to a little bit, you pause it, you maybe try it yourself in Excel, and then you watch a little more, you pause it, you try it yourself in Excel. If you just watch the 9 minutes, your eyes start to glaze over. So I'm not going to play it now, but if this is something you think you might want to do, please go ahead and look at that tutorial. It's actually very well done. It's just better for a self-directed activity. Okay, so now I mentioned this inverse variance approach. I'll just talk about a little bit more. This is my most fancy math slide, but just to give you a little more detail about how you calculate these combined effects. It's not, there is nuance to it, which is why you want to work with a statistician. It's not just a simple formula that you plug in and it's always the same, right? So the first thing is you want to look at whether you should use random effects or fixed effects. And I'm not going to get into, we could spend an hour talking about this, but very simply, this is what you use in your statistical model. Do you use random effects or fixed effects in the design of your statistical model to calculate the pooled measure? Random effects means you're assuming that the different studies are estimating related intervention effects, but they're all a little different. They're calculating things a little differently. They're maybe using different tools, different screeners, slightly different ranges or measures to put someone in one category or another. That the effects are very related. You feel like you can pull them together, but they're all a little bit different. In that case, you would use a random effects model. Alternatively, if what you're asking is very straightforward and it's very common, everyone would measure it the same way, then you can use a fixed effect model. That assumes that all the studies are estimating the same intervention in the same way with their effect estimates. So all those squares on the forest plot, all those rows on the forest plot are all measuring the exact same thing in the exact same way across all of those studies. Maybe what you're interested in, that is how it's measured. There's a very common way, everybody measures it the same way, then you stick with fixed effects. But if not, then you would use random effects. And again, that's something you could talk about with the statistician who's helping you, if that's not you. If it is you, you probably already know what I'm talking about. And then I already talked a bit about the weights. They often, though not always, use inverse variance. So that again means that the larger studies, they tend to have a smaller standard error. They're given higher weight. And then, oh, what happened? Oh, I guess that's it. They are given higher weight, and therefore they affect the pooled estimate, the combined estimate more, right? When something has more weight, it pulls the average towards that instead of having little effect on the average. So every study is not treated equally. That's basically, that's as fancy math as I will get. But if people have specific questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. So let's just talk about some of the primary issues with doing meta-analyses. The first thing to know is meta-analyses are not magic, right? They're only, oh, let's stop that. That's too much. They're only as powerful as the inputs. And you're not the one conducting the primary research. You are not the researcher doing the study. So you are at the mercy of the researchers who did the work. You're synthesizing and reporting on what others have already done. And you can't convert correlational studies into experimental studies. If there's study selection bias, you can't eliminate that. That's what you have to work with. You can't fix your major study limitations. That's just something that's important to know. And that should help you decide whether you should be doing a meta-analysis in the first place. Because if most of the studies that are in your review have these problems and you're kind of not sure about the quality of the effect, then you probably should not be going to the trouble of doing a statistical effort to combine all of those studies and then say that you now learned a bigger and better truth. It won't get rid of all the problems of those underlying studies. Sometimes people think that if they do a bigger, because they're getting a bigger sample size by pooling studies, that it makes those other problems go away, and that's just not true. It just covers them up a little bit, but it doesn't make them go away. The next thing is that different studies are different, right? So there's variability among the studies. It could be that so you have to think about heterogeneity. It could be that there's different clinical diversity among the populations you're including. Could be diversity among the methods that are being used or the statistics that are being used, the statistical models that are being used. Could be some combination of all of these. So you should only do meta-analyses when there's enough homogeneity, there's enough equivalence or commonality across the studies that you think it makes sense to pool them together. You don't want to take a whole bunch of totally different kinds of fruit and say, well, now I could tell you about fruit, right? You want to compare all a certain kind of apple, right? Or they might all be slightly different apples. They might be slightly different sizes, but you want them all to be close enough that you feel like you can say something about that particular fruit. That's what you're trying to do. The next thing is to think about missing data, right? This is often a big issue with meta-analyses. Sometimes the individual studies that you will find have a lot of missing data, especially if there's a lot of loss to follow-up. Or many people are excluded from the study for some reason. If that's happening, it's not necessarily that they're saying we didn't have this outcome and so that's a lot of missing data. It's essentially you might get missing data because a key part of the participants that you would be interested in are not there at the end, and so you don't have the outcome data on them, for example. So you want to think about some of these types of missing data and possible reasons for them, including missing outcome data, as I just mentioned. So that might count as selective reporting bias. The measures maybe don't include the outcome you want, or there are individuals missing, either at the start, like there's selection bias in the study to begin with, or at the finish because they were lost to follow up. So your final outcome that you're interested in, you're missing a lot of people, and maybe there's a real reason that those certain types of people were dropping out of the study. It might also be that you are missing important studies that never got published. That's known as publication bias. And we'll actually talk about that a little bit more today. There are some ways you can test for publication bias. And there are more. So you can think about missing data. It's just important to pay attention to it. And if you're doing a meta-analysis, you need to decide how you're going to deal with the missing data. You could ignore what's missing and just analyze what's available and then describe for the people reading your article what was missing and what the implications of that could be. You could try to replace the missing data by imputing some sort of outcome. There are statistical ways to do that, which a statistician should be able to advise you if there's a good way to actually impute what's missing. For example, by using the data you see from other studies that are similar, there's ways to do that. Or you could use statistical models that specifically allow for missing data. But again, these are sophisticated techniques that you would want to use with someone who really knows what they're talking about. I see the question in the chat. I just saw it, which is the total weight always 100%? Essentially, yes. When you're calculating a weighted average, you're assigning different weights to the different groups so that they make up they each have a certain essentially slice of the pie, but the slices are different sizes, but in the end you always have a whole pie. So I guess the answer is yes, yeah. Okay, so let's just talk about how you can avoid some of these big pitfalls that are very common with meta-analyses. The first is to try to ensure that all the studies are the same study type. So this would be a reason that, especially if there's a lot of articles published about whatever your topic is, that if you think you want to do a meta-analysis, you might say, we only want to look at randomized control trials, or we only want to look at cohort studies or longitudinal studies of some kind. The reason for that is that it can make them all like apples, right? It can make them all more consistent, which can give you more confidence that when you're pooling the information in a meta-analysis, you're actually learning something valid. Because you don't want to just run some statistics and then say, here's what I found, isn't this helpful? And actually it's misleading or not a good representation of the truth, right? So that's one way that you can do that. Another is, oh, that says more tomorrow, but it's actually more today after the break, is to be aware of publication bias, which can affect your findings. We'll talk about that more. I already said you can be aware of missing data. Really, asking yourself, what do I think is missing? What do I see when I'm reading this full text? What do I see in here? You could actually have a column for your data extraction about missing data, and then you can see what are the things that I'm concerned about with missing data is what's the percentage of loss to follow-up, or what percentage, another way that it might not be described as the percentage loss to follow-up. It might be described as, the N, the total N in the study, and then what's the N where you actually got the final outcome. And you want to know that information so that you can decide what to do with it later, right? Being aware of the missing data is important. The other thing is that if you're doing a meta-analysis that's based on means, that's really only it's only appropriate to do that for data that are more or less normally distributed. And again, if you're not a statistician and this doesn't mean much to you, then that's okay, but you should do this with someone who knows what this means. So you want to look, are the data skewed? Do I need to transform the data? Is some of the underlying data, are some people providing odds ratios and some are giving you log odds? Make sure that what you're combining makes sense, and do whatever kind of data transformation or data cleaning you can before you include things in a meta-analysis. And finally, you want to ask yourself, if we're going to do this in the first place, are we comparing, if you're comparing apples and apples, great. That you can feel much more confident. If you're comparing apples and oranges, okay, maybe that's okay. Maybe they're close enough. You talk about why the apples and the oranges are both worth including together. Maybe you say what's different about the whole group of apples of all of your studies compared to the whole group of studies that are oranges. You look at them as sort of separate groups. But if your studies are apples and chickens, maybe you don't want to do a meta-analysis, right? Because it doesn't make sense to try to compare. What are you going to say about what you're learning by looking at apples and chickens together, right? Probably, I can't think of any research question that would be useful. So that's what I would say about meta-analysis. Okay, I think that was a lot. And I think before we go into the next section, which is about evaluating the risk of bias and publication bias, it's probably a good time to take a break. I see that there's a question in the chat. I won't keep you from taking the break, but I'll look and respond during the break in the chat, so you can all check that when you come back. So it is, I think, 10:33. How about if we come back at 10, we'll give you 10 minutes again, 10:43. Thanks, everyone.
Recording stopped.
judge studies, but really to understand how bias might affect confidence in the results. So when we evaluate the potential for bias, we do what's called a risk of bias assessment. And sometimes this is called a quality assessment, or we also refer to it as critical appraisal, which we discussed just a bit of our first day. So the most commonly used tool for randomized controlled trials is the ROB2 tool. We will go into a bit more detail here about the Cochrane Risk of Bias tool, which you can get at the website on the screen here, riskofbias.info. And I believe Shelley is going to drop into the chat. And this is what the tool actually looks like. So similar to when we went over the Prospero registration, this is also a form that guides you through a series of questions. The difference is that this one is completed for each individual study in your review, not for the review overall. So this is what the first part looks like, which is preliminary considerations for the study. And then this tool assesses the potential for bias in each study according to these 5 domains that are on the screen right now. Number 1 is bias arising from the randomization process. So for example, how the allocation sequence was generated and concealed. So how, so the second domain is the bias due to deviations from intended intervention. So things like whether participants and staff were blinded or if analysis followed the actual protocol. The third domain is bias due to missing outcome data. So this includes loss to follow-up, it includes attrition, it includes large amounts of missing data. Number 4 is going to be bias in measurement of the outcome, so such as whether measurement error or misclassification affected one group more than another. And then lastly, bias in selection of the reported results. So this is whether the analyses or outcomes that were reported were pre-specified or if they were selectively reported. So each of these domains helps you identify where bias may have crept in to the individual study and how serious that bias might actually be. And so here's an example of what the tool looks like in one of those domains. In the first column, you see that it asks a question. And then in the second column, it provides some guidance about how you should answer that question. Based, you have read through the question and that guidance, you would choose either Y for yes, PY for probably yes, PN for probably no, N for no, or NI for no information, and then you do this for each individual question. In some cases, you also might see, by the way, an option for not applicable. There is a template that you can find on the course webpage, and you can download that and use that exact template to guide you through this tool. So once you have answered all of the questions in a particular domain, the tool provides this flow chart that helps you determine the overall risk of bias, whether that is low risk of bias, has some bias-related concerns, or if there's a high risk of bias. And so you can see here, there's this stoplight indication with green being low risk, yellow being there's some concerns, and then red being that there's high risk. And you can see how there's a flow chart from, from the actual question itself within the tool. And then it flows into whether something, if you say yes or probably yes, or if you say no or probably no, or if there's no information whatsoever, it gives you kind of where that path is. In order to be considered low risk of bias, the study has been judged to be at low risk in all of the domains. In order to be considered that there's some concerns, then there's some concerns that have been raised in at least one of the domains. And then if a study is high risk, at least one domain has been judged as high risk of bias, or there are some concerns in multiple domains in a way that substantially lowers confidence in the results overall. And ultimately, you want to track the amount of bias in each study you're including in your review, and then you're going to report that out in your paper. So it's really important to note that this happens after you have finished screening in with the full text. You don't make decisions on which studies to include based on risk of bias. You make those based on your eligibility criteria, so that inclusion and exclusion criteria, otherwise your PICOs. And then once you know what's included, you will evaluate for bias after that. And then you report that as part of your review findings. The goal is really to give readers a sense of how much weight to put in a particular study's findings. And if you're doing a meta-analysis, it's also a good tool for you to decide whether that makes sense and what statistical methods are really appropriate. So for example, if your review has a lot of studies with high risk of bias, maybe you don't want to bother with a meta-analysis because you won't be confident in the results overall. For instance, if most of your included studies have a high risk of bias, you might decide that pooling results wouldn't be meaningful, or that the evidence base overall is too weak to draw really firm conclusions. And sometimes your takeaway might sound like, we identified 24 studies on this topic, but 22 were at high risk of bias. And this highlights the need for more rigorous research before any firm conclusions can be made. And that can be part of it. Lastly, while the RobVis tool isn't required, it's a great free option for visualizing the results. And these two examples on the screen right now are created from that RobVis tool. It creates these traffic light plots, again, the green, yellow, and red, as well as some weighted bar plots, which make it really easy to show readers at a glance where bias concerns lie across all of your studies. And you can easily identify which studies are deemed high risk of bias, so those are in red. Those with some concerns that are in yellow, and those with low risk that are in green. And it really makes it easy to quickly identify risk of bias across the board. So if you see a lot of green, that's great, green or go. And if you see a lot of red, then you know to kind of question some of the validity of what you're seeing. And I'll hand it back over to Shelley to talk a little bit more about evaluating specifically publication bias.
Thank you. I do just want to say quickly that the Rob tool that we put the link in the chat, the Cochrane risk of bias tool, is not the only way to do it. It's probably the most commonly, you'll see it most commonly in systematic reviews you read as the tool people are using, especially if they're evaluating trials, clinical trials, which is what Cochrane is originally set up to do. And sometimes reviewers will be comfortable with that, they'll know that, but you don't have to use that. Someone yesterday shared the critical appraisal tool, we can I can find and put in the chat shortly today, and we can actually add it to the course website too, so that you have it when you go back to the website. That's another tool that may make more sense for you, and you may like it better, and that's fine. I've also worked on systematic reviews where we created our own system for studying bias. We, instead of, instead of using, these domains and these specific flow charts, we created our own flow chart where we said these are the things we think will contribute to bias for our particular topic and questions. And so here's our rubric for how we're assessing that. And then that became a figure in the paper where we showed the rubric, we showed the same type of thing where we went through and it was very clear to the reader how many studies and which studies had which types of bias so that they could assess for themselves, how it made sense to combine or what they were learning from different studies. So any of these methods are okay to use. The point is that it's important to do it. The Prisma checklist requires you to have some sort of evaluation of bias. You need to evaluate the bias and you need to have some way that you're reporting on the bias of the studies. So that's the major takeaway here. Thank you, Sada, for putting that critical appraisal tool in the chat. And yes, we will also, when I add the recording after today's session, I'll add it to the course website. Dr. Zhang, did you want to add something? Or no, you're just you just came on video. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Oh, we can't hear you. I don't hear any sound, but maybe you can add something to the chat if you can. Or you can feel free to unmute and interrupt in a bit. Okay. We'll give him one more. Oh. Okay, we'll let him interrupt when he works out his sound. Okay, so the topic that we wanted to talk about related to bias is specifically evaluating publication bias, which is another thing that's very important to do with reviews, and the Prisma guidelines expect that you will do something to assess publication bias, and we'll talk about that. But it's something that isn't always done, right? So this study is showing that only 33% of reviews, when they did a review of systematic reviews, they found that only 33% of them had actually followed this guideline and assessed publication bias. So we're going to teach you how to do that today because it's important and it's not done enough. Publication bias, as is highlighted on here, is a tendency in the literature overall. It's not about the bias in a particular study. It's the tendency for people to publish only results that are statistically or clinically significant. So basically, if people do a study and they find something that has real statistical significance, they submit it to a journal, they're more likely to submit it, it's more likely to get published. And if people do a study on the same topic, but they get a null finding, or maybe they get a negative finding and they're not certified, then or they get a finding that's not statistically significant, then either they choose not to submit it in the first place for publication, or they have a lot of trouble getting it published, and so it never gets published even though it's a null result. The reason that matters is that you can imagine if you are doing a systematic review and you're saying, I'm looking at all the studies that were done on the topic. You're not actually looking at all the studies done on the topic. You're looking at all the studies published on this topic. So if there is a lot of publication bias about that topic, if only certain types of studies end up making it into the publication databases, then you are getting a skewed picture of what's really happening out there from all the things that are studied. So hopefully that makes sense. This can be a little confusing for people who haven't heard this before, but I have some slides to try to illustrate it, and hopefully it will become clear. But if not, we have some time to talk through it. The main way to evaluate publication bias is through something called a funnel plot. And the reason it's called a funnel plot is because it's supposed to be shaped kind of like an upside down funnel, right? So when you produce a funnel plot, you are essentially looking at all the studies. Every circle in here is the different studies that were included in your review. This is especially if you're doing a meta-analysis. All the studies in your meta-analysis, and you're looking at different than the forest plot. You're looking at the precision of the estimate, how precise the estimate was, and then how strong the estimate was. Was it strongly positive? Was it strongly negative? Right. So here's another example. The precision again is the y-axis, the standard error. And then on the x-axis, you're looking at, does this favor the intervention? Does this favor the control? So this is a different kind of plot from the forest plot because it's meant to tell you something different. And you're looking to see if the funnel plot is pretty much symmetrical, which tells you there probably is not publication bias, or is it asymmetrical? Funnel plot asymmetry is an indication that there may be publication bias. Now, you can't fix that, but it's important for you to say, we looked at this. We think there is publication bias, and this is what we think that might mean, right? That's the idea. Okay, so let me give you 3 examples of how this might look. So here is a funnel plot that is pretty symmetrical, right? What this is, the open circles here are showing smaller studies that have these relative risk up here they favor the intervention. The relative risk is 1 to 4, but they're smaller studies, so they have lower precision, and they ended up without statistically significant results. Okay, so these studies have no statistically significant results, and they're all kind of clustered here. But overall, they were still published, even though they weren't statistically significant, right? So your overall plot, the funnel is symmetrical. This is a good sign. There's the absence of reporting bias. Now here is an asymmetrical plot. Sometimes if you create the funnel plot of your studies, it looks like this. And this is a very classic asymmetrical plot. It is relatively common that when you create a funnel plot of all the studies you include in your meta-analysis, you end up with something that looks like this. This is obviously not a symmetrical funnel. And what's missing in this example are all of these smaller studies with no statistically significant results, right? They're just missing. They were never published. They were never published either because the people who did those studies said, those were too small. We didn't really find anything significant. Never mind. Nobody will publish this. We won't even submit it. Or they tried to submit it. They submitted it to 10 different journals, and no one wanted to publish it because they said this isn't actually important or noteworthy. I think it is much more common nowadays. People have really started to understand the importance of publishing results, even when they're null findings. And so it's much more common that you will see more recent studies like this will fill in the funnel plot. But that's not always true, especially for older studies. It used to be much harder to get studies published when they did not have statistically significant results because they were considered not really saying anything interesting, right? Or not really saying anything meaningful because they weren't statistically significant. And especially if you're looking at a lot of studies that are older, you may really see the same thing. It might be this side, right? It might be that the smaller studies are on this side. It doesn't have to always be on the right side. But the idea is that part of the bottom of your plot where the standard error is bigger because the studies are smaller and there's no statistical significance, that part of that plot is missing. Okay, and then this is a third example that you might see, and that would be also an asymmetrical plot, but it's a different problem. So in this example, you're seeing bias, but it's due to the smaller studies being more methodologically flawed, right? They have more, they would have higher risk of bias from the prior description of bias that Sara was just going through. They use fewer methodological safeguards. They were done more in a smaller way, and as a result, the results are biased. And so you end up with, instead of where they should be, you end up with a concentration over here of a lot more studies, which says, something might be going on. Something might be biased because you don't see the same thing when precision increases, right? Up here, it's still symmetrical. It's still going on either side of the null up here, but as your precision drops, suddenly everything starts to clump over on one side. And so if you start to see that, that's telling you there's probably a different type of publication bias related to methodological flaws. Whereas this, where you don't see that clumping, they're all pretty evenly spaced, you just have a whole piece missing. That's usually showing you that smaller studies with statistically significant results never got published. Okay, I know this can be a little confusing for people, but hopefully these are 3 examples that you can go back to, start to wrap your mind around it. There's a paper here that does a good job going through this that you can look at, and there are some tools also on the website to help you think of how to do this yourselves. So I'll just show you one more example, and then we will pause and see what questions people have. This is an actual, the prior slide were just examples to try to demonstrate the concept. But here's an example of an actual funnel plot that was published in a systematic review on PrEP awareness and willingness. They had done a systematic review and meta-analysis of global data around people's awareness of HIV PrEP and willingness to use HIV PrEP among men who have sex with men. And so you can see in both cases, they looked at the awareness effect and they looked at the willingness effect. These were the 2 things they were interested in. It's a different funnel plot for each outcome. And you can see that both funnel plots are actually pretty symmetrical. There's more or less the same kind of dot spread on each side. It's not going to be ever as perfect as these, fake examples trying to illustrate. It's always messier, but okay, it's actually pretty symmetrical on both sides. And they also have fairly low standard error, right? They're very clustered up at the top, which is a good sign. This means that the studies that are included in the review are actually very precise. So it doesn't much look like a funnel in this case in the same way, because it happens to be a topic where there are a lot of large trials done and a lot of studies that have low standard error. But regardless of the standard error, you're seeing kind of the same amount on both sides of the line. And that's the spread of the effect estimates is fairly wide, but it's also fairly symmetrical. So these authors, I think correctly, took this as evidence that there wasn't much publication bias that they needed to deal with. Again, you can't fix publication bias. Your role is to assess the publication bias, report on publication bias, and then say whether you think this is something that readers should be worried about. And if you end up with a funnel plot that looks more like this, then you would say something like, based on our funnel plot results, we're concerned that smaller studies showing no statistically significant results are actually missing from this picture, which might be skewing our meta-analysis, right? It might mean that when we pooled what's left, we're seeing a relative risk that's kind of more lopsided over here than it should be had there been no publication bias. So that's the kind of thing that you're going to do in your report when you look at publication bias. Okay. Again, I know that that was a lot of detail. And actually, when we meet in December, there are some other further tools that are like quantitative statistical tools you can use to assess publication bias. You can come up with like a statistical number to tell you these things. But we decided, for the purpose of explaining it to you all now in this virtual format, this is enough for you to at least conceptually understand what it is, do a little more reading on it if you're interested in diving in that far before we meet in December. But if you, between now and when we see you in December, can do all of the searching and screening and data extraction and start to write up what you're seeing, things like assessing publication bias are the very important but sort of bonus things you do at the end that help contextualize the study. They're not core to you being able to do the work, and so we put less focus on those so that you have for now, so that you have more time to do those core pieces that we've gone over for the last 3 days. So with that, that's actually our last slide for today and for these 3 days. I'll stop sharing in case so we can see a little better. But we do have a bit more time, about almost 15 more minutes, a bit more than 15 minutes in our allotted time. So we certainly can have any questions that anyone has about what we went through today or any of the last 3 days. We were so clear that there were no questions. Or maybe there was just so much information that you all need more time to go back and watch the recordings again and think through things. Just as a reminder that after today, we will, these recordings are very large, so it takes a little while to process. I wouldn't run to the recording in the next 10 minutes, but certainly by tomorrow or by Monday, you should be able to go in, see the recording of today. The recording from the prior 2 days are already on the site, as are all of the tools we've gone through today and many more tools that we didn't specifically go through, but they're there for your resources. And let's see. And then for the groups that turned in the PICOS information yesterday, as I said, I need probably 20 more minutes to finish making sure that I have thoroughly responded to everyone. And then I will send the comments back, I think, to Nyap, and then have you, because they're all on one document for me, then I'm hoping that you can copy and paste the piece for each group into communication just for them. And so you should get something back that has our reflections on what you've done and any suggestions. Great. So here's a question. I'll try to start answering this, but Sada, you may also have things that you want to say, because I know you've looked at this issue before. I would agree that the risk of bias tool, it's a Cochrane tool. It's designed more for randomized controlled trials. So some of the pieces will not feel like they apply if you're not looking at trials. I would say the best resource is actually the one that your colleague suggested yesterday, the JBI Global Critical Appraisal Tools, which Sada put into the chat a couple right before this question in the chat. When you click on that link, which I'll add to the course website right after this, you can see that they have all different kinds of, they have case control studies, cohort studies, economic evaluations, prevalence studies, and when you click on each of those, it has checklists They're not quite the same as the risk of bias tool in that they're more, here, I can maybe actually show you one. Yeah, let me just show you one as an example. So here's one for prevalence studies. Okay, so this one's specifically designed for prevalence studies, and there's this checklist, and so it asks you these types of questions, and you say yes, no, or unclear, right? So was the sample size adequate? Were valid methods used? And you're deciding yes, no, or unclear, but then it doesn't tell you, it doesn't have like a flow chart that says, therefore, here's your answer. You as a team would look at how many yeses, how many nos, how many unclears, and then you decide, should we include this? Should we exclude it? Or do we need to get clarification? And the idea is that you actually document your reason for exclusion. And then it's up to you when you're writing up your systematic review to visually describe this in some way. That Robvis tool will probably not be that helpful to you, but you could do something similar. You could show like that graph, that bar graph that had the green, the yellow, and the red. You know, you could design something like that yourselves. You just have to decide what's the scheme that you would use, and you report what you're finding from the studies. And they give you a lot of detail about it. And this is just the prevalence study one, but there are a whole lot of choices there. So that's another one you might use. Or like I mentioned, you can always come up with one on your own. That's something that you think makes sense for your study, as long as you're being clear for your reader how you're assessing the bias so that they can see whether they think you did that in a logical way. That's really what you need to do. Sado, is there anything else you would add to that? No. Okay. Okay, let's see. I'm looking at these other things in the chat. Oh, good. We're going to take a group photo. How funny. That's great. Fun, not funny, fun. Do you want me to do that? Do you want to take the group photo now and then we can ask a few more questions?
Yes. Yeah, I would like to, yes, if everyone turning on the camera now, it would be great to take a group photo.
Yay.
So, Ming, are you ready for a group photo?
Yes, I will capture it now.
It would be great to every one of
Let's
you.
look at the camera, okay?
And I'm trying to see who's sleeping and who's not sleeping. I'm sure that Shelly and Sarah did a wonderful job, and many people still attending. By now, I see 50 something participants. That's a great number. I rarely attend any training that lasts that long and still keep so many people engaged. Thank you, Shelly and Sarah. Okay, let's see if we have anyone else turning on camera and a few more others. Can you all turn on your camera if you can hear me?
I will take
Okay.
a photo now.
Từ từ đã Minh Anh ơi, đợi mấy phút nữa để các một số các chị đang chỉnh trang sắc đẹp. Thì cứ bình tĩnh. Và còn một số các thầy các cô nữa. Đấy, đúng rồi, biết ngay một các cô đang còn chỉnh trang sắc đẹp. Okay, anyone else? Let's see. Okay, so let's get the first group. So we will take photo. For me, there are 3 pages. So please just smile, and then until Miang says stop. Okay, start. Can you start, Miang?
Yes, I will take a picture.
So tell us stop when you are done.
Yes, I'm done.
Okay, great. Okay. Thank you all very much for being a wonderful participant. And of course, thank you, Sally and Sarah, for wonderful introduction to systematic review and meta-analysis. Could you also tell participants what I expected of them from now until December?